All right, welcome back, everyone, to our last session of what's been a really rich and full day. But we have a great way to top it off with our guest, Senator Chris Coons, a Democrat from Delaware. And Senator Coons was elected to the Senate in 2010, following terms as Newcastle County Council President, that's not easy to say, and Newcastle County Executive. And in the Senate, he sits on a number of committees, including Appropriations, Judiciary, Foreign Relations, Small Business and Entrepreneurship, and the Ethics Committee. And Senator Coons, we are really thrilled to have you with us. Thanks so much. I know it's an incredibly hectic time in the Senate these days, a little crazy time as well. And I think you have a few remarks you'd like to make to kick us off, if that's right.
I do, if I might, David. Thank you.
First,
I wanted to thank you. It's great to see you again. I remember well our conversation at the Halifax Security Conference and appreciate your leadership of this event today. To everybody who's attending, who's joining us, to my dear friends, Cindy McCain and former Ambassador and Congressman Mark Green, and everybody associated with the McCain Institute and with Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. Thank you for a chance to be with you. We're here to talk about the struggle for democracy and where the United States stands in relation to China with regards to democracy. This has been a tough couple of years around the world for democracies, whether it's in the developing world, in Africa or Southeast Asia, whether it's in Europe, or some would even argue in North America. Democracy has been under assault and in some ways in retreat in recent years. And I think it's important for us to talk about the ways in which our own policies and our own politics here in the United States have resulted in that significant challenge. I was just on the floor of the Senate talking with some of my colleagues, both about the upcoming impeachment trial of former President Trump and about the events of January 6th. And what's the significance of all of this? What does it say to the American people about the vibrancy and health of our democracy? And what does it teach the world? I think that the relationship between the United States and China is going to be the defining relationship of the 21st century, or more importantly, the contest between open market-based democratic societies and authoritarian states, digital authoritarian states, is going to be the defining contest of this century. And I think the US-China relationship is one that cannot be simply reduced to one of either competition, conflict, or cooperation. There's areas where we must cooperate if we're going to have any chance at confronting climate change, at ending nuclear proliferation, at resolving the challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's others where we can and should compete, a broad range of areas where we can and should compete while still preparing for the possibility of conflict. And if we're going to begin a new chapter in successfully competing with China, it has to begin with strengthening our own democratic institutions, with investing in our own capacity to innovate and to solve problems. As I have been saying to colleagues in recent days, President Biden's put forth a very bold plan, this $1.9 trillion American Recovery Plan. A big part of my hopes for the coming weeks is that we will negotiate in good faith to some bipartisan resolution because of the strength of the example that would set for the world about the functionality of our democracy. If we're going to compete from a position of strength, we need to renew our historic role as a champion of human rights on the world stage and here at home. And we're going to have to stand up and challenge more forcefully and more effectively China's actions, whether in Hong Kong or in Xinjiang, and the ways in which Xi Jinping has taken the Chinese Communist Party and China in a different direction. President Biden shares an assessment with the Trump administration that China is our #1 foreign policy challenge, but we'll come at it with different tactics, with different tools, ones that will begin by embracing our vital global network of allies and by strengthening the ways in which we are joined together, not just by interests, but by values. So let's move to questions. I appreciate, David, the chance to make just a few framing comments, and I so look forward to our conversation today.
Senator, thanks so much. I really appreciate those remarks. And let me pick up on China, if I can, to get us going. Bipartisanship is a rare commodity these days in the US Congress. Is policy toward China one area where there might be some agreement between Republicans and Democrats?
Yes. In fact, I was just talking to Dan Sullivan from Alaska, a hawkish Republican veteran, if ever there was one. And he and I are doing a joint speaking event tomorrow on the U.S.-China relationship, something he's very excited about. A week ago, we traded speeches. I gave him the last major address that I gave at the Wilson Center and the Nixon Library about U.S.-China relations, and he gave me a speech that he gave to the IRI, to the International Republican Institute, about U.S.-China relations. And after each reading the other speech, we reconnoitered on the floor and said, we agree on about 85%. The differences are more tone than substance. Let's see if we can't contribute towards building a stronger center around the U.S.-China relationship. Nothing would concern Xi Jinping and his leadership more than seeing the outbreak of genuine bipartisanship in terms of our long-term strategy here in the Senate and between the Republicans and the Biden administration.
We're going to have a panel devoted to China tomorrow, but let me ask you on the issue of human rights, as you mentioned, China, the Communist Party and the Chinese government's record is appalling. When you look at what's happened in Hong Kong, when you look at what has happened in Tibet with the Uyghurs, what can we do to try to make the Chinese leadership understand that the path they're on is hurting certainly their people first and foremost, but also their standing in the world?
Well, there needs to be consequences and accountability. We're going to need to strongly support the UN Commission for Human Rights investigation into the treatment of the Uyghurs and events in Xinjiang province. We're going to need to mobilize our allies, in particular our European allies, to also stand up and forcefully call out and confront China's bad human rights record. I'm encouraged that there are voices from close allies like Canada and the United Kingdom on behalf of those in Hong Kong who've stood up for democracy and pressed for China to respect their commitments, commitments they've clearly broken with the recently enacted national security law and then the surge of roundups of those who were democratic activists. I think our only path forward is to be a stronger voice, a more sustained voice, and we are both when we do so in partnership with our close allies.
What about Chinese muscle flexing, not only in the South China Sea, but we see it through the Belt and Road Initiative with using financial economic means in the Indo-Pacific region more broadly? How should we be addressing this challenge?
We have to stand up and call out ways in which Belt and Road is debt-trapped democracy. I do think Secretary Pompeo was forceful in his criticism of Belt and Road, but we need to also offer an alternative. We need to challenge our partners, the Nordic countries, the UK, Germany, France, Japan, Australia, others that have development financing available to work with us and with our new DFC to provide financing alternatives to Belt and Road financing that's transparent, that doesn't present the same challenges in terms of labor and environmental degradation, and the same challenges in terms of corruption. Kenya in East Africa is a country I've been close to for decades since I was a student there as an undergraduate. And the Chinese just finished building a railroad there that was literally the most expensive railroad in human history on a per mile basis. Half of the Treasury senior officials are under investigation or in jail. There was widespread corruption. There was failure to follow basic environmental and labor practices. And it's my hope that in follow-on infrastructure projects in Kenya, the United States and some of our other key partners will offer competitive financing for more transparent, more sustainable projects, and that around the world, in Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Africa, we will see model projects where we are competing head-to-head with China, and where in the end, we're able to show countries in the developing world that they're better off when they insist on more transparency and higher standards. Obviously, the Chinese have poured a huge amount of money into Belt and Road, but I'd urge viewers to look at the difference between the announcements they've made and how much is actually being invested, and then talk to the development leaders, the elected leaders of the countries that are participating in Belt and Road about how they feel at the end of the project, whether it has in fact advanced their national interests and their development goals or not.
So before we leave China, I received a question here, and let me encourage people to submit questions through the Q&A function and students to identify themselves. And one of them is from an international relations student here, Yusra Ben Karani. I hope I've pronounced your name right, Yusra. First, the student expresses appreciation for you being here. And on China mentions how intertwined the U.S.-Chinese relationship is. And are we willing to hinder relations in order to try to advance human rights and democracy? In other words, can we use some of the leverage in interest that we have to try to exercise a little more influence on the relationship?
Well, the U.S.-China relationship is profoundly different than the relationship between the United States and Soviet Union. And those who talk about a new Cold War with China are missing the significance of the difference in terms of our economic interconnectedness. I spent 8 years working for a global manufacturing business that had its most advanced work in research and manufacturing in Western Europe and North America, but had 50 factories in China with which we were very closely integrated and upon which we were dependent for a lot of our supply chain. That's typical of most American headquartered advanced manufacturing companies. In fact, in many fields, Chinese competitors are equal to or superior to American companies, particularly ones that are pure play digital technology companies. So, whereas we have things like PayPal or Amazon, they have equally sophisticated, built out competitors. We need to use the leverage that we have in terms of access to our market and the markets of the West to demand that China either stand up to a higher human rights standard or be pushed aside in terms of their access to some of the most desirable markets in the world for their goods. We are in a moment of challenge with our European partners because most of them have decided they want a security relationship with the United States that is close and integrated, and an economic relationship with China that is close and integrated. And as long as China continues its brazen theft of intellectual property, its open violation of basic human rights standards, and denial of access to its markets to some of our most competitive and innovative companies, we shouldn't tolerate this. So the United States needs to diversify its supply chain so that we are not overly reliant on China. We need to strengthen the lens of CFIUS through which we review strategic acquisitions in the United States by China, and in particular, companies strongly influenced or controlled by the CCP. And we need to look at onshoring some of the manufacturing that we've allowed to go offshore, and in particular to China, without really thinking about the strategic consequences.
So let me shift to the Middle East if I can. And you've been very outspoken about the terrible crisis in Yemen. What would you recommend the administration do there about the situation in Yemen? Would you also favor a pause or a suspension in arms sales to Saudi Arabia, which has itself been alleged to have committed a number of war crimes in Yemen?
Yes.
Fair enough. I've been around long enough.
I can speak more to that if you'd like, but it's often
go on.
A one-word answer. Look, I think we need to re-examine our relationship with the kingdom. When there was a change in leadership, it was encouraging to many of us to hear talk about fundamental reform in the kingdom, openness to changing the role of women in Saudi society, openness to considering the rudiments of democracy, at least at the local level. But the combination of a brutal war in Yemen in which gross human rights violations have been committed, and the medieval killing of Khashoggi, an American resident journalist who was dismembered in a Saudi consulate, in combination has made a lot of American leaders, in particular members of the Senate of both parties, take a step back and say, what is it we are getting out of this relationship? Long a critical security partner, long a critical energy partner, yes. But in terms of conduct in the human rights field, treatment of journalists, human rights domestically within the kingdom, and this disastrous war in Yemen, it comes with a cost that for many of us is just too high. So I would support a pause in arms sales. I would support Privately, some very tough conversations about changes in direction and thinking about our partnership. But, my real hope is that reformers in the end will win out in the Saudi kingdom and that we can get back to pulling in the same direction. But that is not a foregone conclusion. And we cannot, as a country, afford to let security considerations trump basic human rights considerations so brazenly, so openly, and for so long.
Let's move to a continent you know very well, and that's Africa. And in the confirmation hearing for now Secretary of State Antony Blinken, you raised concerns about recent developments in Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda. What would be your recommendations for the administration when it comes to the African continent?
First, show up, be engaged, be positive, respect Africa and Africans as the partners in advancing democracy and development and finding compelling solutions for the challenges of this century that they are, can be, and have been. I think the treatment of Africa as a continent by the last administration, well, it doesn't deserve much consideration. We need to show up and demonstrate positive, forward-leaning engagement. One of the worst aspects of the Cold War was that the United States and the Soviet Union treated Africa mostly as a chessboard on which pawns could be moved about, more than we principally looked at the legitimate aspirations and concerns and needs of the African people and 54 African nations. So first, I think by choosing an ambassador to the United Nations who is well-grounded in Africa, has been all over the continent, has served as an ambassador on the continent, knows many of the leaders on the continent. President Biden has made an important first step by having a Secretary of State who is quite familiar with the continent. That significantly helps as well. And obviously, how President Biden himself engages with critical leaders and institutions on the continent will matter. Ethiopia is a crisis. The most recent Nobel Peace Prize winner before Governor David Beasley, the World Food Program, has launched a war internal to his own country in Tigray, where he has brought in Eritrean forces. This deserves the urgent attention of the United Nations and of our leadership to try and pull Abiy back from the brink in Ethiopia. In Mozambique, I am profoundly concerned about an Islamist insurrectionist group that is arguably getting some comfort in Tanzania. The extent of that, I'm not at all certain, but the Mozambican government and military may well not be able to handle this, and I think it is metastasizing quickly. I have concerns about Nigeria, the direction that they're going, as soon to be a country more populous than the United States, a multi-ethnic, multi-faith, multilingual democracy. We should be investing more time and attention in Nigeria. South Africa is a country which is groaning under the burden of this pandemic, and in which we could be helping to co-finance the manufacture of some of the most compelling vaccine and therapeutic products. It is in many ways the most advanced economy on the continent. And I am urging President Biden to embrace President Ramaphosa, with whom he had a very promising initial conversation, both in his role as AU chair and as president of South Africa. A nation much like the United States, again, with a long history that although far from parallel, the similarities are striking at times. I really think we should be preparing to engage actively all over the continent. And President Biden has chosen just the right leadership to be able to do that. And I look forward to supporting them in this important work.
Let me shift to an issue that has dominated the lives of all of us for the past year now, and that is, of course, the pandemic, where there is obviously an urgency to do whatever we can to take care of those here in the United States, to vaccinate them. But how do we also spearhead the international efforts to distribute the vaccine globally so that we don't deepen the inequalities and inequities that we have already been experiencing before the pandemic even hit?
We should be fully participating with COVAX. I was encouraged that one of the first executive orders signed by President Biden led towards our doing a U-turn on departing from the World Health Organization. We can't possibly get a well-financed, well-organized global vaccination campaign underway without participating in the World Health Organization and in COVAX. I also think there's things that we can and should do with some of the American-led vaccine efforts, whether it's Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, AstraZeneca. Some of these were developed obviously in partnership with European countries. The Chinese and the Russians are offering their vaccine around the world. I have real doubts about the safety and efficacy of the Russian vaccine, concerns about the transparency of the testing protocols followed in the case of the Chinese vaccine. And I think as a country that long could hold its head up as a world leader in humanitarian response, whether it was to HIV/AIDS, H1N1, or Ebola, the United States should be at the forefront of financing, producing, and delivering vaccines, whether it's to India, South Africa, Brazil, or Nigeria. The argument I am making to my colleagues here in the Senate is that as we see the virus continue to mutate, which is what viruses do, and we see more deadly or more transmissive new variants arising from the United Kingdom, from Brazil, from South Africa, we have to realize it is in our own selfish national interest to not just vaccinate as quickly as we can every American, but to vaccinate the world. Because if we end up in a situation where the United States is wholly vaccinated, but COVID-19 continues to cook away in dozens of countries around the world, we will rapidly face a variant more transmissive, more deadly, and that is not affected by the vaccines we have just developed and deployed at such enormous expense. So for as little as another $10 billion, which is what's in President Biden's plan, we should be able to do our part to contribute towards the rapid scale up and manufacturing of vaccines in South Africa, in India, in Southeast Asia, and then support their distribution. Financing the distribution and the manufacturing of vaccines, I think, is in our vital national interest, but will also restore some of our reputation as a good partner in global health.
So Teresa Schuster, who's a political science student here at FIU, comes back to China, but linking it to North Korea, where we see continuing nuclear weapons development in North Korea, enabled, she says, by China's support for the North Korean economy. What can we do to encourage denuclearization and limit Chinese influence in the region without raising any questions or concerns about our security guarantees to South Korea?
I got to tell you, the DPRK and Kim Jong-un is the enduring challenge that across several administrations of both parties has simply gotten worse and worse and worse. Donald Trump as president tried bold, unprecedented personal diplomacy. You may remember his love letters back and forth to a horrific dictator whose human rights record was appalling. It did produce some summits, but they produced very little of substance. And we have no better insight into the contours of their nuclear program, but at least their public pronouncements suggest that they're continuing to innovate both weapons and weapon delivery systems, which puts all of us at greater risk. My first advice, of course, would be for the Biden administration to closely review the available intelligence. But we need to strengthen our regional partners. South Korea and Japan have some natural tensions as a result of their own histories, the conflicts of the last century and some unresolved issues between them. I think rather than berating them about contributing more to our mutual defense, President Biden and his national security team needs to get their arms around the relationships with South Korea and Japan and strengthen the three of us as engaged partners with North Korea and get us aligned around a common vision. And then this has to be a centerpiece of President Biden's diplomacy with China and with China's leaders, with Xi Jinping, because bluntly, we cannot solve North Korea without China. The same is likely true about Iran. China has played a role in proliferation in the region, in North Korea, in Pakistan, and in Iran. They can play a constructive role. They can play a harmful role. And getting the United States and China aligned around nonproliferation in Iran and in North Korea is a critical piece of tough diplomacy that we've got to do this year.
Senator, let me try to squeeze in two more questions in the
Sure.
few minutes we have left. Max Ulloa, I hope I got Max's last name right, a senior here studying international relations, asks about terrorism, particularly a growing concern, he says, in sub-Saharan Africa. What can we do to help without getting bogged down in some of these issues?
Well, the Sahel, the 5 countries of the Sahel have faced a steadily escalating burden from extremism and terrorism. The frequency with which there are mass casualty events in Burkina Faso, in Niger, in Mali is heartbreaking. And the United States and our core allies in the region need to have a long-term strategy that looks at how to prevent fragile states from becoming failed states. We need to begin with development and diplomacy, and then add the resources of our defense community. The French are major players in defense in the region, in security, but we have to come up with a development and pro-democracy agenda that actually advances the interests of people who have long been marginalized, who are not connected to their central governments, and who are willing to either tolerate or actively support some of the extremist groups in the Sahel because they don't see themselves as having a stake in governance and opportunity in the region. This is a region under enormous pressure from climate change, and where there is a lot more we can and should do, and a region in which I've been actively engaged. I have visited all the countries of the Sahel, and I think the United States needs to strengthen our focus in terms of our sustained engagement there.
We got a question from Tbilisi, Georgia, which is 9 hours ahead of us. So Batu Katalia, a good friend of mine, is still up and watching. Asks about alternative solutions in dealing with Chinese and Russian money and projects. What about pushing more free trade agreements with strategic partners? And I assume Batu has in mind Georgia, but you can address it in a broader sense.
Look, I do think the United States needs to use the attractiveness of our market and the economic tools that are available to us as a free market, as an open society. In the African context, I've long seen the power of AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which President Clinton signed into law, and the draw of connection to the American market with Georgia and other countries that are on the periphery of Russia and that are constantly torn between closeness to Russia and closeness to the West. We need to offer opportunities. We need to offer market access. We need to offer financing. In the immediate post-Soviet era, we were very actively engaged, invested, did a lot of outreach, did a lot of sort of pulling countries like Georgia, Ukraine, and others towards the West. We need to renew that engagement in a way that helps stabilize some of these fragile democracies that are former Soviet republics.
Senator, we have a minute left, and I would be remiss if I did not ask you about a big development that obviously will take place next week in the Senate, and that is the impeachment trial of former President Trump. Any predictions or thoughts on what might happen there?
Tragically, because I think it is important that we demonstrate that this constitutional accountability mechanism has vibrancy. I think we will spend a week on the trial. I think the stunning, disturbing facts of what happened on January 6th and the role that President Trump played in summoning an angry mob, inciting them and pointing them at the Capitol. I do not think there will be enough votes for us to impose the accountability of a bar from future service in office. I know there will be debates and discussions about censure as an alternative. I actually just had a conversation about that on the floor with a colleague urging Democrats to step back from proceeding with impeachment. But I must say the events of January 6th, as someone who was not just a casual observer, but a witness, this is a moment that deserves accountability. And we will struggle to find that accountability with one of our two major political parties still in the thrall of former President Trump. So my hope against hope at this point is that somehow a presentation by the House managers of a truly compelling case will move a few more Republicans in our direction. But as of right now, I'm not optimistic that that will be the outcome.
Senator Chris Coons, Democrat from Delaware, incredibly grateful that you found time to spend with us today to wrap up our second day. Thanks so much, sir. Really appreciate it. And hopefully next year we can get you down to Miami where it's in the 60s today, not to rub it in.
That'd be great. Thank you, David. Good to be on with you.
Senator, thanks very much. And that brings us to an end today on day 2 of State of the World 2021. I'm David Kramer with Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. Want to thank all my team here who have really done a heroic job in pulling all this together. Special shout out to Rigo and Andre for all the tremendous IT work that they have done. Without them, we wouldn't be streaming to you yesterday and today. We will be back tomorrow. We have 3 more days of the conference to go, a lot to cover, and we hope you will join us. We start at 9 a.m. sharp. As you noticed, I hope that we've been pretty punctual throughout this conference, and we're going to try to continue that trend tomorrow, 9 a.m., looking at the global implications of illegal fishing, a huge issue down here, not just in the Florida area, but in the Caribbean and Latin America. Hope you'll join us tomorrow. Again, thanks very much for joining us today. This is a wrap for day 2.